do that today because I want to get you kind of understood how I've been trying to teach these classes. I try to get the big picture. I try to get something that is in there that can be useful for our lives. That's why I always have asked you to think about what takeaways you have. Okay, so try to keep that in mind. If there's some details in there I'm missing that you wanted to cover, you know, I think we're just going to have to be satisfied with kind of getting the big picture out of this as best as we can. The second thing I want to say is because Zechariah is beginning to talk more about the restoration of Israel, which a number of the major prophets do as well. Ezekiel in particular, I think, goes through some of that. I am not one who believes that modern-day Israel is essential to that whole restoration process. And I know there's a lot... I know there's a whole evangelical theology that revolves around that. I'm just, frankly, I think that's one of their Achilles heels. I just think if, you know, the Lord doesn't come back within the correct span of time, how are they going to explain that? And actually the next, when they think about Israel, supposedly will have been, Christ is supposed to come in within a generation of when Israel was restored, okay, which was modern Israel, 1948. And usually we figure a generation either 25, 40, or 100 years. It just depends on the interpreter, how you look at what a generation is supposed to be. So the next big date is 2048. I don't know that I'll even be around then. I'll be 100 in 2048. So, but the fact is, the way they interpret Scripture, it's just not, to me, it's not very convincing. Anyway, be that as it may, I kind of wanted to get that cleared up before we moved along and we get into the whole thing where Zechariah does talk about Israel being restored or God restoring their fortunes. Okay, I don't think modern day Israel is the key to all this. For what that's worth, I just figured that's something I want to just mention before we get too far along. Okay, well, I have my power cord today. I was telling somebody I also printed the slides, so if we had a problem, I've got the printed slides here to use. But let's talk about Zechariah. We already know he worked right alongside with Haggai, the prophet we studied last week. He tells us very clearly that this is a project inspired by God, not by might or by power, but by my Spirit, said the Lord. That's this passage. If maybe that's a familiar statement to you. Here's where it comes from. It's from the prophet Zechariah. By the way, we only have one left this week, of course, and that would be, who's next? Who's the last minor prophet?
Malachi.
Malachi. Okay, that's the next reading we have, and then we're through. So Zechariah approaches the whole subject of encouraging Israel by using visions, by the visions he's given. And by the way, you'll notice in there, maybe I have this later, but anyway, you'll notice in there that there are kind of three words. The word of the Lord came to Zechariah, the word of the Lord came to Zechariah, 3 times. All of them happen to be in the 2nd and 4th year of Darius, okay, the ruler at that time. So it's just interesting to me that he gives specific times and dates. This isn't like, hey, I was in ecstasy, I don't remember when it was, here's when it happened. Puts it in a historical context. But anyway, he approaches the subject through some visions. The first 6 chapters are all different visions. There's 8 of them that he gives us. Some of them are a little obscure. We're going to go over them. I think I have some understanding of what they are. These are my understandings, not anybody else's. Okay, so we'll see how we do. He warns Israel not to fall prey to the sins of their fathers. That's the very first thing he starts with. Don't be like the people before you. They weren't doing the right thing. They were being disobedient. We'll talk about that when we get to our discussion as well. The second half of the book is where we really get into the whole question of what's happening next. What's God doing for the future? How's he going to bring this about? What is he going to bring about? And he mentions quite a few things. It's where we have our predictions about the Messiah specifically. Will come riding on a donkey, pierced, sheep will be scattered. Shepherd has struck, sheep will be scattered. Some kind of unusual predictions about the Messiah. At least that one seems to me it is. And again, his messages are given specific dates during the reign of Darius. All right, let's talk about the visions for a moment or two. And let me just start by getting you to give me some feedback. What did you think about all these visions? Did you understand them? Were there any in there that you went, ah, man, that's pretty cool. I like that one. It gives me some encouragement. I am assuming, of course, you're all reading these before you come into class every week. If you don't, I'm not. Okay, it's okay. I'm just kind of giving you a hard time, okay?
Verse 8, the horses, the white, seems all to me in Revelation, chapter 4 horses.
There are some images here that he uses that is used again. Now, they're used a little bit differently, but they're still used. Those images are still given, aren't they? Book of Revelation, or the four horsemen of the apocalypse, we often call them. So there's a number of visions here that he uses some very, I don't know if I want to call them standard pictures, but standard images. He uses images that are used elsewhere. He may use them slightly differently, but he still uses them. Anybody else?
He was real big on the number 4. 4 this and 4 that.
Hadn't thought about that.
I don't know what that, I don't know the significance, but he used 4 a lot.
Okay, yeah, usually the numbers 3 and 7 and 12 are the complete numbers. Okay, 4 almost is complete, plus complete, I don't know. Why would he, anyway. So, yeah, Ron.
Let's see, the vision concerning the branch where the iniquity is going to be removed in one day.
Okay.
I like that.
Okay.
In the church, we see diagrams of, everything before the cross, and then the cross, and everything after the cross.
Yeah.
And that one day
Yeah.
kind of reminds me of that.
Right. And you have to think about how the people who heard all these were thinking of them. I'm sure they didn't get all of the significance that was going to be fully revealed by the time you get to the first century. But that's one of the things that I'm always thinking about. Well, what did they think about this? How did they interpret what was going on? Anybody else? All right. First of all, verses 1 through 7, chapter 1, is the warning where he says, don't be like your forefathers, don't be like your ancestors. All right? We'll kind of, I'll have a little bit of a discussion on that later, but this is where it occurs. And then he begins to talk about the different visions. The first is the horsemen. As was already mentioned, you see the same image in Revelation. At least some consistency. I kind of see that as a patrol to protect Jerusalem. Now remember, he and Haggai both are trying to encourage the remnant of Israel who have come back to Jerusalem to keep going. Everything that he does and says is meant to encourage them, or challenge them, or remind them. Verses 1 through 7 is a reminder, hey guys, don't be like your ancestors. But here all the visions come, and I get, it's all about trying to give them a sense of this is where you need to be, keep at it. Okay? So I kind of see that as a control to protect Jerusalem. The 4 horns and the craftsmen. I'm not sure about the horns, but from what I read through that whole context, it seems to me that the craftsmen are there to build something as a revenge against the nations. I'm not sure if that's right. I'm just thinking about how he probably tries to intend these things to encourage them, and that they're smarting, are they not? I mean, they're hurting from what everything that's happened. Even if they had to admit they were wrong, they're feeling some pain about all the fact that they've been sent away to Babylon, and the nation's been destroyed. God punished them. Anyway. Surveyor. What does a surveyor do? Surveyor plots some ground, trying to get things set up to build. Okay, and I get the impression that is surveyor's there to lay a new foundation. It's interesting in this one, chapter 2, verse 13, he says, "Be silent before the Lord." Okay. Let's not have too much animosity going on here. Let's not have too many words. Just know that God's working on this. And then, of course, the high priest and the branch being a fairly obvious reference to what we know of as Christ later on. And we get that from Isaiah chapter 4 and some passages in Jeremiah where they speak of the branch that's going to come from the root of David, from the stump of David, that a branch is going to eventually come and he's going to be the ruler. Again, how much of that did they know? Well, of course, they would have known about Isaiah and Jeremiah. They would have had that as a part of their thinking that somewhere along the line, God's going to do something with the descendant of David. Okay, and he brings up this idea of the branch here in chapter 3. Visions 5 through 8, the gold lampstand. In this case, he's using the lampstand to represent God watching them. How are they used in Revelation? The lampstands. Yeah, the 7 churches of Asia are each seen as a lampstand. Okay? A lampstand does what? Gives vision. Provides light. Okay, now, again, he's using this slightly differently, but he's still using a very similar image to get his message across, isn't he? Flying scroll. We see scrolls in the book of Revelation as well. What does John have to do with the scroll he's given? Do you remember? What does he do, Jan? He has to eat it. Really sweet in his mouth, but what happens when it gets into his stomach? Yeah, it's bitter. There's some words in there. This appears to me to be a decree to destroy evil. Okay? And you've been through 70 years of captivity. You've been abused by your enemy. You've been abused by, if nothing else, verbally, you've been probably abused. But the nation itself has been taken away. Well, you're kind of okay with the idea that evil's going to get what's coming to it. I'll bring that up later. Thinking of something as I go along here. The woman in the basket, that's an unusual one to me. She represents evil, and that evil is going to be taken away. It's going to be taken back to Babylon. I don't know why she isn't just destroyed, but, she's taken away. She's sent away from the people of Israel. And then, of course, the 4 chariots are the 4 spirits of heaven who roam throughout the earth. Okay, and again, there are some allusions here to what we see in the book of Revelation as well. They're using similar images. This is one of the things that, to me, presents a little bit of some mystery to what's going on here. Not because I don't understand what they're doing, but he uses them in different ways. They aren't always consistent in the way John will get them in the book of Revelation. But the fact is, you see some of these same things being used. It's, I don't know, just a consistency, at least, in the imagery that they're going to use to try to encourage. Now remember, all this is meant to encourage them. That's why I've tried to think of these as sort of positive spins. Positive ways of helping them to see, through these visions, guys, just hang tough. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep rebuilding the temple. He never actually says rebuild the temple, but that's always in here, isn't it? It's always in the background. That's what he wants them to do, and he's giving them a lot of encouragement. Then we come to chapters 7 through 14. What happens in chapters 7 through 14? Anybody remember anything at all about what you saw in there that stuck out to you? Remember now he's going to be talking about the future.
Talking about the growing of this hope that they have, a growing of the seed that's been promised to them. It's going to come about.
Okay. You use the word hope.
Yeah.
It's kind of the important part of this, isn't it? There's a sense of hope. They still have a future. One of the more hopeless things that happens to people is they don't think life has anything left for them.
peace and joy.
Yeah, peace and joy. Right? They don't see that either, but he's saying that this is a part of what's going to be happening. What else did others see here in chapter 7 through 14? The most obvious ones are the references to Christ, which we know those things are fulfilled in the life of Christ. I think it's the Gospel of John that picks those out as much as anybody does. Yeah.
Says here, justice and mercy,
Where are you now? What part?
chapter 7.
Okay. So is he promising them justice and mercy there?
It says not fasting.
Huh?
Not fasting.
Okay. Yeah, I want to get into that in a couple of minutes here. I got a discussion question on the fasting part. All right, well, let's go through here. Future plans for the kingdom. That's the import of chapters 7 through 14, I think. What to look for when the king comes, or a branch. What are the clues that he's given us here that would help unlock the plan coming on? We're beginning to get some clues here, aren't we? Talks about you will have love, truth, or actually he's encouraged them, love the truth and peace. Put those things before you. That's what you want to focus on. He talks about judgment against the enemies of Israel. We've talked how many times about what's the concept in some of the other minor prophets that reek of judgment coming. That tell us judgment is coming. About the day of the Lord. It's mentioned several times in several of the prophets. Sometimes they misunderstood what the day of the Lord was going to be, but he says a day is coming. Day of judgment is coming. It's the day of the Lord. It's going to be judgment. It's going to be salvation. It's going to be both. But the fact is, judgment against enemies, it's not all that far from their minds. Right or wrong, right or wrong, we have to let God do the revenge. But the fact is, you guys ever watch a show or a movie that you go, man, I sure hope the bad guys really get what's coming to them here. We really want that. For better or worse, it seems like there ought to be some balancing of the scales. Well, he's telling them it's going to happen. It's not going to happen the way they expect, which is pretty typical of the way God does things, but it's still coming. And we had a long discussion a couple of weeks ago about whether or not we ought to feel that way, but that's another, we won't go back into that. Restoration. Restoration, or you could even use the word redemption here. Right? You're going to be restored. It talks about good and bad shepherds. I don't remember the chapter, but I know Ezekiel has a lot to say about the bad shepherds and how they are really not caring for the flock. It's one of his harshest criticisms against the leadership. Larry?
Doesn't Peter?
No, I'm sorry. Larry's first. He beat you to the punch. I'm sorry. Yeah, Larry, go ahead.
Back on the restoration and that there'll be peace, talking about the older people be able to sit in the streets and watch the younger people run.
Yeah.
There's going to be a peace. You're going to have. It's not going to be like it used to. I'm going to bring Jerusalem back and bless you.
Yeah.
And that, I hadn't thought of it until I read about being able to sit in the street and watch the kids play.
Yeah.
That's
Those of us who are grandparents really get that image, don't we?
With the cane and
With the
everything.
cane, everything. Yeah, sitting there just relaxing. Just the kids. It's a real joy to watch your grandkids just play. Just enjoy themselves and laugh. There's not much more pleasing to anybody to hear a little kid laugh like crazy. That just really gets into you, doesn't it? It's so much fun, but that's the image we get here, isn't it? There's a joy to that. There's a peace to that. Yeah, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Peter, I think First Peter says, I am a fellow elder,
Mm-hmm.
and he was chewing the elders out for not doing it.
Well, I don't know if he was chewing them out, but yeah, he was challenging them. Let's put it that way. I don't know that we're supposed to chew our elders out, but we can implore them, can't we? Yeah. So, and as a fellow elder, he has a right to say some things to them about especially somebody who was an apostle himself. So, yeah, it's leadership is an important part of our community, isn't it? And how they work and how they treat the flock is an important key to all of this. All right, so we'll talk about that a little bit. Ultimately, God is going to win. If there were any message that you get out of Revelation, that's the one. We win. We are going to win. The battle is the Lord's. Those of us who are sitting here in a certain time may not always be able to see that very easily. I'm convinced the early church was having a little trouble seeing it, and that's why God gave to John the revelation. He says, guys, look, hang tight, you're going to win. Now, he will say to the churches, to he who overcomes, I will give a crown of life, and there's all kinds of, in fact, if you go look at all those churches, to every one of them, he says, number one, you got to overcome. Number two, there's a different gift given. That's one of the more interesting things about that section of Scripture. They're all going to get a gift. The key, overcome. 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 God's going to give them the strength, but remember, we're going to win. Always remember that. All right. Any questions or comments before we go into our discussions? Any thoughts? Anything you want to encourage the rest of the group with?
About Israel in the Bible, like New Testament, it's the church. It's
Sure.
spiritual.
Yes. Sure. Sure. Well, that's why I mentioned in the beginning that I'm not convinced modern day Israel is the key, as some people seem to think. Now, whether or not we support as a nation, the nation of Israel, that's politically that's probably another whole issue. But I don't think it's founded in our religious beliefs. Some people think that it is, but I don't. Yes. Did you have a comment?
We've already won.
We've already won. Yes. Yes. Doesn't always feel like it.
No.
I
had to win
Yeah.
because we've already won.
Yeah. We're still on the field. We're still playing, but yeah, the game's ours. Yeah.
Satan's still at bat.
He isn't. He's still working, isn't he? Yes.
Our challenge is, like their challenge was to be faithful unto death, and
Yes.
obviously the crown of life.
Yes, for sure. All right. What warning does Zechariah deliver in the first word, chapter 1, 1 through 7? We've already mentioned it, but let's talk about that a little bit.
Don't sin like your forefathers.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you think Israel should think about this in light of Daniel's prayer of repentance? We talked about that last week in that Daniel chapter 9. I think that's one of the more powerful prayers in the whole Bible, I think. And Daniel, the guy who was a righteous man himself, he says, man, we're sinners. So, how do you think the people in Jerusalem there are feeling about this? Think they're taking it seriously? Think they're taking it to heart? Somebody get 1 Corinthians 10, 6 through 11 for me, please. And somebody else get Romans 15, verse 4. Who's got 1 Corinthians 10, 6 through 11? Yeah.
Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written. The people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in pagan revelry. You should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. We should not test the Lord, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come.
Israel's history is our history, isn't it? People of God. And there's a pretty stern warning. Just don't be like them. I knew of a man a number of years ago who lived a pretty bad life. And when he became a Christian, I don't know if it was one of the elders, somebody said to him, you know, if nothing else, you can always serve as a bad example. Which wasn't the kind of example I'm sure he thought he would eventually be. But you know what? Sometimes your own life can be a reminder. You know, don't do the things you used to do. But here it's a matter of look at what happened to the people who didn't really pay attention and didn't faithfully serve God. Don't be like them. I mean, those are examples for us. Useful for us to remember. Remember, they're part of our history. Even, you know, we look at Jacob and wonder how God chose Jacob. At least I do. Sneak. But, you know, God chose. Just don't be like. How about Romans 15, verse 4? Who's got that? Real quick, and then I have some questions. Yeah, go ahead.
For whatever things were written before were written, for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope.
Yeah. I like that one in a way because it gives a little different slant on looking at the past, isn't it? Patience, hope, okay? We might be comforted, okay, but looking at the past, and I think I probably did that in the very first lesson because I think that's why we look at the Old Testament. For one of the reasons. You know, we learn from it. We learn what people did. We learn how God interacted with people in the past. And, you know, we learn how to direct our own lives. All right, I had a couple of other hands up. Who had their hands up? Yeah.
If anybody heard about what happened the other day about a judge that sentenced him to 6 years, he came out, he went and tied the judge to a chair and shot him.
Okay.
No, this is what happened on the news. And, yeah, that wasn't a bad example.
No, that was a pretty bad example. Pretty bad. Yes.
I think that, you know, we talked last week in Haggai about how the Jews had come back and they really weren't engaged. They were kind of building their own houses and planting their crops and things weren't going that great.
Yeah.
And so I think what Zechariah says to them here is the wake-up call is what they exactly needed to remind them of this, and this is what brought them down there in verse whatever it was to repentance, and then they got with it. They started building the Lord's temple and so forth, and so I think this reminder, I mean, these folks had lived a tough life. They had been taken to battle and brought back, things were bad. They were living out the consequences of their forefathers' sins, and I think this is exactly what they needed, that Zechariah gave them this, and it brought them to repentance, and they went to work.
Yep.
It's a whole turnaround.
Yep. Yep. Zechariah and Haggai both, they challenge them some, don't they? So you guys don't forget these important issues here. I know you're home again, but you know, you still have some things you have to do.
They must have done it with authority, like when Jesus spoke. He talked with authority.
Yeah.
So they must have known
Well,
it was God talking.
Seemed like it was pretty clearly recognized. I mean, they make it very clear the word of the Lord came to Zechariah.
Right.
Okay. And somewhere along the line, they had to recognize that, yep, he's speaking to us now. I want to get to actually the third question here. We talk about the visions a little bit. Chapter 4, verse 6. An interesting statement. I'm guessing that's one you've heard. This is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel, not by strength or by might, but by my spirit, says the Lord of armies. It almost, that to me, it almost seems like we're just kind of thrown in there, you know. But it's, has anybody not heard that from the pulpit at one time or other in their lives? Most of us have heard that. It's a pretty common reference to us being made aware that, we do whatever we do by God's power. Can you give an example of when you relied on the Spirit of God and not on your own strength? What does it look like? That's what I'm trying to get people to think about. How does that look in your life? What kind of things do you do to rely on the Spirit of God?
It's everything. It should be everything in your life.
Okay.
Raising your children, the way that you are in life, your jobs, your example, just everything that you have, and even you personally, when you know you're struggling with something, whether it be forgiveness or it's something that you're struggling with, you're not relying upon yourself. You're relying upon the strength of the Lord. So every aspect of our life should be always that.
About the power of God in our lives. Yeah.
Twice the church has gone through a separation. And what's funny to me is God left me out of the separation. And it's like, so God is silent.
I'm sorry, say the last part again.
God is silent to me. And like, that says a lot. Just God being silent. Lets me don't get up. That is enough. Just sit back.
What does Isaiah 40 say? Those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. I think our recent events are sort of the elephant in the room here, aren't they? It's been tough. It's been kind of tough on everybody. It's part of the struggle I'm having, quite frankly, with developing lessons that will still help us over this last couple of weeks. And I'm not saying I have an answer. Okay, I'm not going to try to point out this person did that, that person did that. I don't know. I was not directly involved. But it hurts, doesn't it? How do we pick up and go on? The only answer I can give you is the one that's here. He who waits on the Lord will be renewed in strength, will rise up like on wings of eagles. There's probably some other things, maybe. I hope that each of you is perhaps aware of others who may be struggling, and maybe you can give them some support. You don't always have to have exactly the right words either. You just have to be there for people. You just have to be present in their lives and say, you know what, we're going through this together. Let's walk together. So I really don't know. You guys have been here longer than I have. You know some of the other people. How can you do that for others? How can you do that for people you know are really kind of having a struggle? Talk to them. Just be present with them. You don't have to have exactly the right words. I think we feel like we always have to be able to say the right thing at the right time to the right person. It's not always going to happen. Yeah, I had Bill had his hand up, and then John.
I was just going to say that I think we all trust in the Spirit of God, because there's things we can't handle.
Yeah.
And so I can think of thousands of things I can't handle, and I can worry about them, and I can be concerned that something's going to happen, like global warming or whatever.
Yeah.
But if you can offload those onto God's shoulders constantly and have trust in Him, then it makes life a whole lot easier.
Yeah.
Then you just worry about what you got to worry about.
There's I don't know how to. There's a kind of way of thinking going around that I'm going to grow up and I'm going to change the world. Or I've even heard people on TV shows tell groups of young people, man, you guys are going to change the world. And I'm thinking, nah, probably not. You know, there are some things you can do to make the world in which you live a little better place. Not the least of which is change yourself first. But to go out and tell people, wow, you guys are going to change the world. That's just, I'm sorry, that's just not going to happen. Well, maybe it will. Maybe somebody will grow up and be a great political leader, religious leader, I don't know. But still, it's not you that's going to change the world, is it? That's the whole point of this. It's God that's going to change the world. It's God that has changed the world. The world has become a really different place since the first century. Anyway, who else had their hand up? Yeah, over here. I'm sorry, no, he was next. Sorry, I got to go in order here, otherwise I'm going to take attention.
I was just recalling, relying on the Spirit. My dad died when he was 61 from leukemia, and he had fought it for a few years, been in remission, out of remission, and so forth. And so it was getting to where there was more bad days than good days, and so he was going to quit taking the medicine. And so I told him, I said, no, you got to hang in there and keep fighting because they may find a cure tomorrow.
Yeah.
And he finally said to me, he said, you got to quit working against me. He said, I'm praying that I go, and you're praying that I stay. And so he said, you gotta quit working against me and get on the team. And so that's the hardest prayer I ever did.
Wow.
But it was realizing two things. One, realizing that I don't have all the answers, and that I'm thinking about my will, not my dad's. But also realizing that you just gotta trust the Lord, and He's gonna determine.
He's going to give you.
He's
the
going to
strength
determine
see
the
it
outcome.
through. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's. Let's face it. I mean, watching a parent go or watching your spouse go is certainly one of the most difficult things you'll ever have to face. How are you going to get the power? How are you going to get the strength and hope to go through that? Strength by night, Spirit of God. Yes, right here.
There's two things. The last thing you said is that you go out there and change the world. Yeah, it's going to start with me, right?
Yeah.
That's the beginning place. But most of the older people in here is going to have heard this thing before. It's like people don't really care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's an old saying I heard.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of those things are, they're good little proverbs, aren't they?
Yeah.
Good little proverbs that remind us of how we're supposed to go about it. All right, we're running short on time. I want to see which one. Renewal and restoration. Just look at the stuff he talks about fasting and go back later today and read Isaiah 58. Okay, there's a lot of religious. This kind of strikes at the heart of religious behavior. Fastings were sort of set aside. We do this a certain amount of regularly. And Isaiah has some pretty strong words, so does Zechariah about that. Characteristics of good and bad shepherds. You might want to just take a look at that as well. I think that's an important thing for us to be thinking about. Predictions of Christ. This is an interesting one to me. What do you think the contemporaries thought about those predictions? Number one, he's going to come riding on a donkey. Number two, the shepherd is going to be struck and the sheep are going to be scattered. Is that what they thought was going to happen? Number three, he's going to be pierced. What's that all about? I mean, that was mentioned also in Psalm 22, I think it is. This prediction of, the crucifixion. Yes. No, Vivek, go ahead.
One of the things that has always struck me, Bob, is in chapter 3, where Joshua the high priest is somehow dressed in filthy garments. And I think you and I know that the Joshua that's spoken of is Yeshua, which is Hebrew for Jesus. And the New Testament parallel with Jesus taking on the sins of the whole world
Hmm.
and the Lord cleansing him, I think is remarkable.
Pretty good illusion there, isn't it?
Yeah, it really, really hits you, you know.
Yeah.
And so you beg the question then, well, who's Joshua in the Old Testament? And this Joshua is the high priest of the remnant. Zechariah, who's the political guy, the governor's son, and Joshua, who is Shealtiel's son, I think, I forget the names exactly, is the son of the high priest. And now all of a sudden the high priest is dressed in filthy garments. Well, wait a minute, what happened? These guys are supposed to have these fancy clothes, right? Well, when they got dragged away in captivity, they saw their high priest getting dragged away and their clothes just getting muddied. After 2 days of walking,
Yeah.
it's pretty nasty. And so this is a picture of Jesus being cleansed, and that's a massive hope for us.
Yeah. Yeah. Part of the reason I'm bringing up some of this is because of my sermon today. God has given us clues all the way through the Old Testament, hasn't he? About what was going on. Did the disciples put it all together? And when did they put it all together? They put it all together after Jesus told them about it. They missed so much. And Jesus had to explain it to them after he was resurrected. We'll talk about that a little bit more during my lesson, just a bit. Connections between Zechariah 14 and Revelation 21 and 22. I'll let you do that a little bit on your own as well, something to think about. Anybody else have any other takeaways that they are going to use for themselves to help their spiritual life this week? Yeah.
I take away, what can I do for God?
Okay. Do you have an answer to that?
No.
But it's not a bad question, is it? Not a bad question.
What can I do for the church?
Okay. All right. How can you give hope to somebody else? Another possibility. Yes, all kinds of hands. Did you have your hand up, Tabitha? Okay, somebody had their hand up back there.
To me, it's like the 30 pieces of silver and all that. There's no way, unless someone explained that to them from God, that they could understand it.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. We don't have to understand everything about God. We just have to be faithful to Him.
Yep.
And that's just as true today as it was then.
Yes, it is. You have your hand up. Who else had their hand up?
He said God is love, so be loving to everyone.
Okay. Pursue truth and peace. It's in there, isn't it? Depend on the Spirit of God. All right, last comment.
I think it affects my focus to focus less on today, present day, and focus on the reward that's coming.
Yeah. The hope that we all have. Hope that we all have that there's something beyond this life. Okay, thank you guys. Malachi next week. Look forward to it. Last of the minor prophets, and then we'll be moving on to something else.
Hey, Bob,
Yes, ma'am.
what do you have any connections between Zechariah what and what? It was on the slide before this.
Oh, I'm sorry. Zechariah 14 and Revelation 21 and 22.
I'm going to forget.
Just a couple of, just think about it. You know, they're not necessarily direct, but there are some, as Zechariah's been doing, he's been using images that appear in other places, which I think says something about the consistency of the Bible. Consistency of God's word. Yes, Ron.
For some of us who have missed some classes, could you tell us more how to get to your website, I guess it is?
How about if I send it to Tracy and have her put it in the bulletin?
That'd be good.
Can I do that?
That'd be
Okay.
good.
Yeah, I've still been a little bit lax about putting the classes up on my YouTube page. What I'm going to do is I'm going to eventually put them on my website
Yeah.
under the Lazarus Chronicles. So I'll make sure I get that done and get that to Tracy at some point. Yeah, sorry about being a little lax. Last week's lesson we missed because we ran out of room on the
SD card.
the card that was in there. So what I'll do is I think I'll just print up the PowerPoint, and I'll put that up on my webpage as well. So you'll at least have the notes. Yay, listen, thank you for that kind of interest. I appreciate that everybody's interested in seeing some of that. All right, Malachi next week, we'll finish up. Thank you.